My name is Odebiyi. I am an assistant professor in the division of teacher preparation, focusing on elementary social studies. My research focus combined two strands of inquiry. The first is looking at what we call learning to teach. How do teacher candidates actually learn to teach? And the second strand looks at how teacher candidates develop pedagogical design capacity for designing inquiry lesson. Within that frame, I have implemented this research idea across contexts, essentially in the United States and abroad. Start to think about what are the commonalities within this idea of learning to teach. Do we have overlap within the frame of how teachers learn to teach, and what are the differences that we have to be intentional about when we're talking about teacher preparation? Take, for example, I found in my homework that to do inquiry, the way we think about it in the United States, there's notion of context within this idea. If you want to do it in city school, there's some modification we have to make. And again, when you do it abroad, for example, in Nigeria, it works better outdoor. And that idea applies to here in the United States if you think about some rural schools. So they have those commonalities and differences, and those are the areas in which I look at how teacher candidates learn to teach, the way they develop pedagogical design capacity, and then across context. So my research is more of cross-cultural idea of learning to teach. What I study, we can think about it this way. It's more of learning to teach from the perspective of design as practice and how it relates to developing social studies teacher candidate for elementary school level, K through 6. Within that idea, the goal is to understand if you're learning inquiry, which they do in science as well, but if you're learning inquiry, how is that specifically applied to concepts in social studies education? And again, not only social studies education, because then we have different strands. We're going to talk about secondary social studies. We're going to talk about elementary social studies. So my research focuses on elementary social studies to start thinking about how do we design curriculum that focuses on inquiry for elementary school students. And again, how again can we teach through inquiry using what some people might call global lens. Other people might call it international perspective. Other people might call it cross-cultural idea. So I lean more towards the idea of cross-cultural, given the notion that, we have teachers from different parts of the world. And again, we're able to actually delineate further how can we tailor this support for teaching inquiry for elementary social studies for different teacher candidates, irrespective of their context. So that is the focus of my research within the frame of design thinking. I arrived in this research idea within my own experience as well. Like I shared somewhere earlier today, I actually started up. My major was in mathematics. Started to think to become a person of number. And again, my education abroad, and again, my experience both abroad and in the United States are making me to think about a more robust way to think about learning to teach. Say, okay, for example, we have more people and much more people having different background in different things. And how can we actually focus on what I call these resources? And that is the idea of pedagogical design capacity. What it means is that how do people identify and mobilize different kind of resources, which includes, I have delineated that in my home research as personal resources. We have what I call curricular resources, and we have what I call contextual resources. Those three areas, how do people identify what they are? And again, how do they mobilize? How do they use them in making sense of how to design a particular kind of lesson? Because that makes me start thinking about, then I'm now removing myself as an individual from my process of learning. That is the idea that we get from current area of research. So then it's more of how can we become more integrative and bring those things together. Matthew, I know who I am. This is my background. And again, how can we apply what we call intentionality? And that is how I got to the idea of thinking about learning to teach as a design, because then it becomes a design to me, because then you have to be intentional, you have to be flexible, and you have to be adaptable. You have to have all these key characteristics in thinking about this particular kind of lesson and different categories of young learners that we're going to design their lessons for. So that's how I got into that level. And again, I love the idea that we can actually think about anything random. Say, for example, people are thinking about video games and stuff. How can we bring those intentionally into the idea of lesson design? That becomes what I would call, that would be an idea of personal resources, because you like to play video game. Yeah, bring it in. Now we have the notion of what we call metaverse or different kind of idea. Hey, artificial intelligence. Yeah, is that what you're good at? No problem. That becomes a resource that we can use to build a kind of particular kind of lesson that may speak to a similar group of students who might be interested in what you're interested in. So that way we make it more integrative, we make it more intentional, more flexible, and then that was how I came about the idea of learning to teach from the perspective of design. Thinking like a designer, like an architecture. Before you build a house, you have to have a structure. So that is more like a structure right there. And how do you apply that in lesson design? That's how I got to where I am. In 10 to 20 years from now, I'm hoping to see, I would like to start by saying that we know that the field of social studies education is more traditional in its own sense. It's kind of more of, it has a lot of status quo, and this is how people do things and stuff. But more recently, we've started seeing people bringing in things that we might think are not applicable within social studies itself. For example, we've had people using probably Game of Thrones to teach concept in history. We've seen people coming up and saying, okay, you know what, we're going to use this cool idea. How can we apply artificial intelligence in social studies? Those are the things that, probably when I was passing through my own education, somebody won't think about it. So in the next 10 to 20 years, I'm hoping that we're able to get to a spot where we become more of a flexible thinker, more of somebody who becomes more intentional in terms of what I would call expansive learning, to think about how can we take learning to young learners wherever they are. How can we take learning to meet different needs, such that they start thinking about, I don't have to live who I am necessarily, in a positive way. Rather, I can find a space where I will be me and use who I am as a strength, what I'm good at as a learner, to be able to start thinking about constructing their own learning. And in the next 10 to 20 years, I'm hoping that the field now we have many of these reform ideas. For example, in the field of social studies education in 2013, that was the last time we have this C3 framework, college, career, and civic life framework. We haven't had another one beyond that. We are looking to see that the implementation of that framework, we are able to actually see the tangible outcome of those framework. And different ideas that we're talking about, like design learning in this angle, and crew teaching in this angle, more of social justice within the realm of teaching inquiry. What are the tangible outcomes that we get from it? And again, how can we proceed from there? So the idea overall is that I'm hoping to see more flexibility in thinking, flexibility in the way we approach instruction, flexibility in the way we think about what is even possible. How can I randomly pick a number, say mathematics and social studies? What would be the correlation? Start thinking about those possibilities of the impossible or seemingly impossible things and see how can we collaborate. And finally, I'd like to mention too, in fact, I have started discussing with a colleague who is in architecture to see how we can collaborate and write a book on the idea of design thinking. If you think about design, you think about engineering. You think about architectural design. How can we bridge that gap and say, I'm in social studies, I'm doing elementary education, you are in architecture. What are the commonalities, and how can we bring that commonality to become more integrative and live the future right now? Because we're already in the future. So start thinking about those ideas. And again, how can we help young learners to start thinking about whatever you're bringing, whoever you are, whatever your background is, irrespective of the context, how can we bring all those together to help you actually achieve authentic learning that'll be yours and that'll be useful? So those are the things I'm looking for, looking at that will happen in the next 10 to 20 years.